Greetings to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larissa Lutsevich. I am the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Welcome to this webinar, Ukraine's crony capitalism versus rule of law. What's the best way to break systema? I'm very pleased that we are hosting this in partnership with the Berlin-based Bertelsmann Stiftung. And I think the topic of today's discussion is so urgent and potent, and it's something that is such an intrinsic feature of Ukraine's political and economic system that has shaped after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine became the kind of eclectic mix of some features that are part of the market and democratic system, but some that allow subordination of public institutions to public infringement, control, and enrichment. And in a way, Ukraine is a very interesting and striking evidence that, you know, the end of history is not here with us, and it's not necessarily the binary model of democracy versus autocracy. Ukraine has managed to create the system that has quite distinctive features in its own. So a lot of this, what we will be discussing today, is holding economy back, and many of us, also funders and experts, are struggling in a way to tackle the symptom of this system, such as corruption, ineffective administration, lack of quality of public services. And we have assembled today an excellent panel that will be looking at the root of this problem that Ukraine struggles and trying to answer the question whether Ukraine can break away from this system and what it will take. I am pleased to pass the floor to my colleague Miriam Kosmel from Berlin, who will lead us through this hour and a half discussion with excellent speakers who she will present. In my turn, I will just say that Miriam is a senior expert for Eastern Europe and European neighborhood at Bertelsmann Foundation. She knows the region quite well. She's spent some time in the region, previously as the head of Friedrich Neumann Foundation for Ukraine and Belarus. Thank you so much for joining, and the floor is over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for the warm welcome, and good afternoon from Berlin. Why this topic? And many Ukraine observers may ask, why again this topic? Because Ukraine is stuck in a development track, and this is despite many reform efforts. We have the annual reform conference going on now in Vilnius, despite decades of expensive aid programs and projects, several mass protests that have been nation and society-wide for better governance, and despite its enormous potential of natural resources and its workforce. So as a starting point for this panel, for which we have, I believe, 5 fabulous speakers offering their specific insights, we offer 2 recent analyses, both by John Love, an associate fellow with Chatham House, who will present the main findings today. Welcome, John. The first, Ukraine's system of crony capitalism, addresses how a non-transparent network blurring political and business interests in 5 economic sectors steers fundamental policy and governance decisions. John uses the term systema for the structures and patterns of action and describes the co-opting of public institutions as a shadow state. The second analysis that Bertelsmann Stiftung did with John, why is progress towards the rule of law so challenging, zooms in on the judiciary, that is the courts and also the prosecutors. They, we believe, deserved an own analysis because they are the key when societal or business conflicts need solving. And they have this dual role. They are essential to overcome systema, but they must be reformed first to function adequately. We are joined by 2 decision makers from Ukraine. Welcome Dmytro Natalucha, Member of Parliament at the Verkhovna Rada and Chair of the Economic Affairs Committee. Dmytro is a member of the faction of the political party Servant of the People, established in 2018. Great Hello. To have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we are joined by Olga Pishanska, who is a public servant. Welcome, Olga. Olga is chair of Ukraine's Anti-Monopoly Committee since July 2020, having been its first deputy chair for some years before that. We're looking forward to your comments and interventions. And I welcome Maria Popova and Wilfried Gilge. Maria is a professor for political science at Canada's McGill University. We've asked her to bring in her comparative perspective. Wilfried is working at the Center for International Peace Operations in Berlin and an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. We've asked him, as a long-time observer of Ukraine, to share with us his takeaways after listening to the panel and to dare an outlook. I'll try to engage the speakers in a conversation for about the second half of our event, depending also on the number of questions you may signal you have. We very much welcome your participation, so please do write your questions into the Q&A function anytime. Ideally, you do that in English. If you can only do it in Ukrainian, we have Orissia here to help. The web seminar will be recorded, and for Ukrainian interventions, if you wish to listen to them in the original, just switch to Ukrainian or stay in the English channel. So, John, with no further ado, you have the floor now to introduce your main findings of these two recent analysis reports I've just mentioned.
Thank you very much, Miriam. This is a rare opportunity to discuss two recent papers in one session. It's great to see the renewed cooperation between Chatham House and the Bertelsmann Stiftung. So very well done to you, Miriam, and to Orissia. Of the two papers, the one on what I call systema was the more demanding to write because of simply the breadth of the subject. It's based on a large number of interviews with people in government in Ukraine, with Western officials, and with people also in different sectors of the economy, because it looks right across the economy. It's an effort to take what I call a wide-angle lens and look at the underlying problem that stands in the way of developing Ukraine's democratic institutions and growing what I prefer to call a culture of rule of law. The rule of law paper was a very interesting task because it required also looking at the case of Moldova. And thankfully, I had an experienced Moldovan specialist by my side. And I have to say that the exercise puts some things for me into perspective, because if you think that Ukraine has made limited progress on judicial reform, well, take a look at Moldova, because it really is disheartening to see how a small country that really should be able to make rapid progress in this area is in fact rather floundering. And I think it should be a warning to Ukrainians of what can happen if you don't make sufficient progress in this area. So let me just cover 5 points on systema. First of all, I think we analysts spend too much time looking at discrete issues in Ukraine. It's easy to focus on the detail and not see the wood for the trees. We spend less time than we should looking at the overall situation and considering why Ukraine functions the way it does and how its underlying model of governance can be changed, or perhaps more accurately, how those interest groups that sustain the system can in fact be incentivized to change their behavior. So interestingly, I found there was a real lack of literature on the subject, and I would say our thinking in this area is rather underdeveloped. There are plenty of experts on specific areas of reform, both in Ukraine and outside, whether it's corporate governance, public administration, judicial reform, but there are not so many people knowledgeable about the broader issues of systemic change and how to bring it about. My second point is that systema is particularly resilient because it's built on strong foundations. It rests on an alignment of interests between big business, what I call in the analysis, the large financial industrial groups, an alignment between them and the political class, simply in favor of rent seeking. And rent seeking here is prioritized over wealth creation for the public good. And across the state sector at different levels, you also find there is a supporting structure of beneficiaries, people who service those interests. And if you start to consider the numbers of people involved and all their dependents, you're really talking about several million people who derive benefit from systema and have an interest in maintaining it. My third point is that systema functions. It functions badly for most of the population, but it functions, and it functions particularly well for the benefit of a few. It's highly inefficient. It encourages poor distribution of resources by diverting state money to favored businesses. It contributes to preserving a poor investment environment because of its need for pliable courts. And of course, it also perpetuates poor legislation through its influence over the preparation of laws. So in short, it limits competition by ensuring that the playing field is not level and is also stacked against new entrants. It also, interestingly, sucks up some of the most capable and best educated people in the country, who as a result do not end up making careers in government or other parts of the corporate world. And finally, it creates a permissive environment for corrupt practices within the state bureaucracy. And it also contributes to a climate of impunity for serious offenders. Ukraine is far from unique in having a system of this kind, but what I think makes it different from other countries is that Ukraine firstly has genuine democratic credentials, and secondly, it's also facing a wide variety of pressures that are increasing the need for systemic change. And they include the priority of resisting Russian aggression, the power of the internal constituencies who are demanding change, and also, last but not least, the expectations of Western allies. My fourth point, the Poroshenko years brought some partially successful anti-corruption reforms, but only those that did not threaten the functioning of systema as a whole. So those successful anti-corruption reforms that I have in mind are the ones that breached some of systema's perhaps worst excesses, and I think here of what was going on at Naftogaz, also at Privatbank.
John, excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me for interrupting you. Could you please continue with analyzing the Poroshenko time after Dimitro's intervention, because he has to leave for a voting session in Parliament, actually on the oligarch law, if I understood this correctly. Which so with no further ado, Dimitro, you have the floor to make the best of our time with you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and I'm terribly sorry for this, but if you would allow me to ask to continue with the presentation, I think I have managed some more time, so I think I can be here until 16:30 with you, absolutely fine.
Oh, perfect. This is great news.
Okay.
So,
Thank
John,
you.
apologies for interrupting.
Apologies, John. I'm terribly sorry.
No problem at all. I was definitely trying to keep to my time limit, but let me say just briefly about the Poroshenko years that I think breaching the worst excesses of the system, Naftogaz and Privatbank, that's very different from trying to change the underlying system and to put the country onto a different model of governance. And of course, Poroshenko claimed many times that because he was fighting a war, he couldn't do anything more. And in my view, the Western partners often were a little bit too generous and cut him too much slack. But Ukrainian voters made it very clear what they thought of Poroshenko's performance. So, you know, voting in Zelensky as they did, somebody with no previous political experience, was not just a bold move, but to me it was one that smacked also of a degree of desperation. So in the meantime, Mr. Zelensky's commitment to improving the lives of Ukrainians, of reducing corruption levels, and of bringing, above all, peace to Ukraine has collided with reality. And I think the battle between the old Ukraine and potentially new Ukraine is right out in the open. So the conflict in the Constitutional Court, the sanctioning recently of Mr. Medvedchuk and Mr. Firtash, the de-oligarchization bill that we're going to talk about shortly, these are very, very clear signs that the issue is out there in the open, as is the reform of the process for appointing judges. So this really is quite a dramatic moment, I think, in Ukraine's development. My fifth and last point is that judicial reform could really finally start to bear fruit if the reforms of the High Council of Justice and the High Qualification Commission of Judges, if these go in the right direction and ultimately break the grip of the judicial corporation. I think Ukraine presents a perfect example of how not to conduct judicial reform. Putting the old unreformed judiciary in charge of the process gave it a new lease of life. They gave it certain defenses. And I think the Venice Commission and other sources of Western advice here did not cover themselves in glory. They failed to understand what they were dealing with in the form of systema, and particularly the entrenched interests of the judiciary. So finally, I hope the Systema paper will spark some focused discussion in Ukraine about the nature of the obstacles impeding reform, because this type of discussion is long overdue. I'll stop there, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I would like to pass the floor to you now, Dmitro. And before I do that, I have one question. I read with great interest your LinkedIn profile, and there is the information on your master thesis that you actually wrote on the Ukrainian elite and its influence over the transition from a directed economy towards a free market economy back in 2013-14. And since then, you've become a member of that elite yourself, first in a regional administration. Now you are chair of the Economic Affairs Committee in the Verkhovna Rada. So has that changed your perception? What are your takeaways? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for this question. And John, thank you very much for your terrific work. It's just tremendous. I enjoyed very much reading and hearing you speaking. I think it's straight to the point. Has my opinion on the Ukrainian elite formation changed? No, it hasn't actually, to be honest, because what we see right now, even though the parliament, for example, has faced a renewal of at least, I think, 40, maybe 60% of the MPs, still the main clans and the main industrial financial groups that control all the media, that control the rent, the national resources are basically the same. I think that it's them who actually do influence the formation of elites quite much. And basically, of course, the election of President Zelensky and the so-called mono-majority was a major disruption to the system and to this basically vicious circle. But we'll see for how long will we stay stay able to basically keep going and confront the systema. Why is it so important? And why the findings of John are really critical, I think, because Ukraine is a very peculiar country that is basically considered a transition democracy, but somehow in terms of the systema is very similar to such countries as China or Russia, who are the most crony countries. And some time ago, in mid-2010, the Economist tried even to introduce this term as crony capitalism in more broad-known academic discussion with its crony capitalism ranking. And as far as I remember, they were specifically China, Russia, and Ukraine who were like among the leaders. And the funny thing is that what these countries have in common Actually, we are quite different. The Communist Party in China, authoritarian personalist regime in Russia, and the transitional democracy in Ukraine. But to be honest, I think the main criteria of all these countries is market economy. But these markets, they look very different, and comparing to those in developed countries. The markets are highly concentrated and they are highly monopolized. And what is most important, that happened because of the so-called insider size. And you can see that very well, both in China, in Russia, and in Ukraine. And that is why we can talk about crony capitalism as another type of non-democratic systems. And here I would like to mention Acemoglu and Robinson, but don't worry, I won't talk about why nations fail. They made a number of brilliant research papers on topic of the so-called neo-patrimonial regimes. And actually is very similar to our situation. And let's take a look on the features. So you have the power of big entrepreneurs, the moguls. We have it in Ukraine. The clientele and patronage system, we have it in Ukraine. Distribution of wealth among small groups of insiders, again, we have it in Ukraine. And to make the long story short, it's a fusion of political power and business. Basically, that is the thing. And why this happened, it's another interesting question. Something probably went wrong during the transition from communism and the command socialistic economy to a free market. And basically, first of all, the mass privatization of the 90s. It was a liberal, without competition, free access. The vast majority of the people who we call oligarchs today, not only in Ukraine, they used to be party functionaries of Komsomol activists. They have been affiliated to different state institutions. And basically, I think this fact helped them to get seed money and reach enough support to be the cherry pickers of rapid marketization and privatization. Moreover, Ukraine has witnessed an incredible influx of Russian capital during the initial privatization. That happened for a reason, because back in the USSR, the most prominent state-owned enterprises have been strategically designed to serve the Union needs, and the Union needs means Moscow. So basically all the export and all the production lines have been oriented to Russia. And for this reason, Russia had a very, discrete interest into keeping those under control. And how else could you control it if not privatize it with Russian capital? And now we have three major problems after this. First of all, it's, of course, as I mentioned, the fusion of politics and business. We have the high level of monopolization and undeveloped model of economy, because for a long period of time until 2014, basically the whole model of economy was to export everything to Russia, because again, as I mentioned, this was the specific design of the top state-owned enterprises. And this is the main problem and the features of crony capitalism in Ukraine, as far as I can see it. And what makes it so dangerous, and in my point of view, the most dangerous thing is that this system, as you mentioned in your research, John, are highly encapsulated in the state machine. Presidents changes, parliaments changes, but nothing changes in all terms of oligarchs. And it is hard to break this vicious circle. And a number of strategic spheres are now partly or fully monopolized by the inner circle. If you take mining or quarrying, so-called, 64% of turnover concentrated under control of people affiliated to political parties. Electricity, gas, water supply, 41% of turnover and 63% of assets. Transport, 41%. Agriculture used to be mostly free market due to amount of small and medium farmers. But during the last decade, we have also seen a sort of concentration. 24% of agro-market is under PEP control, publicly exposed persons. And this is also a reason why Ukrainian economy is so much resource-oriented. A number of researchers, academic researchers, show us that such regimes as crony capitalism are mostly oriented on natural resources and raw materials. And to be honest, manufacturing of final products are both about competition, quality, and free market, and about planning. While resources are mostly about control and are mostly about right here, right now. You don't need to plan at all. You just need to extract them and sell them right away. And because of this, oligarchs are focused on monopolization of resource market, and their wealth is based on raw materials, because basically it's the quickest way to get as much money possible and as much influence as possible as a result. And now we need to find a solution. And as I mentioned before, crony capitalism is resilient, and there is no alternative to destroying the fundament of the system. To misquote, old problems require modern solutions. Now we have a bill proposed by President Zelensky on oligarchs, and we're going to vote the first reading in 4 minutes, I think, maybe in 5. Is it a drastic solution though? Yes, but is it suitable for the situation? Probably also yes. What Theodore Roosevelt did with American monopolies, actually very similar things. The difference is that his opponents didn't have online media, didn't have the main television and the telegram channels under control. So I think we need a rapid demonopolization because it is the only way to stop rent-seeking, political corruption, patronage, and cronyism in Ukraine. And without monopolized industries and lobbying mass media, oligarchs will lose their influence on policy. We don't want to fight against business. That's not our goal. And we want to promote huge entrepreneurship in Ukraine. Everything is interested in big business, but not in monopolized business. And this is possible only after the split of business and politics. And of course, it is better to modernize anti-monopoly law in Ukraine and make it more efficient and comprehensive. And we are going to walk this path as well in our committee, for example. But still, we need the anti-oligarch initiative as an emerging measure against cronyism. And according to my point of view, such ways will make Ukraine less crony and more capitalist, which means more space for democracy and public wealth, and less for corruption and dirty political ties. Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have time for one inquiry?
Yes, of course.
If I understand you correctly, or if my information is correct regarding this law, this draft law, you bring in the National Security and Defense Council as another structure, but you have a structure in place with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, with the High Anti-Corruption Court. What do you believe is the additional value of having another institution involved, and how will you go about determining what is excessive influence?
It's a very good question. Thank you. I think that we dedicate not too much attention to such a thing as economic security. And what is crony capitalism and an oligarchic system is a threat to the economic security of the country, because if they control the strategic number of assets, of strategic assets, it means that basically they have a potential of jeopardizing the processes in the country and to creating social pressure. That is why this issue has been assessed from the standpoint of the National Council for State Security and Defense. This is one reason. The second reason is that, of course, I believe, and it's my personal opinion, that anti-monopoly committee should be the #1 player in the oligarchization of Ukraine. And I think that Ola is doing a very good job, and he has a great team, and she might need some more competences, and that is what we are ready to help with. We are, in fact, conducting a new law expanding the authorities of the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine. But of course, what we need to do, moreover, is to send a signal. A signal to the public, because we won't be able to make it on our own. Because as you well know, the media is very much affected by specific industrial and financial groups. And it will be very easy to basically disinform and to make people disbelieve and to make people confused about what is the initiative about and what we're really trying to do. Already we were witnessing a campaign that this law is all about an attack on the big business, which is not, and it's not the case. So of course there are already the institutions in place that might be instrumental to fighting oligarchs. But as with everything in Ukraine, you will find a situation when somebody lacks some kind of authority, somebody lacks some kind of permit, stuff like that, and then you might see the whole process tapped and stopped. And we surely don't want to do that. That is the reason why I think the president decided to introduce another body into the system to fight the crony capitalism, which is in Ukraine.
Thank you. I think Wilfried and John will comment later to which extent they are convinced. Dmitro, until when can you stay with us now?
I think I have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. What about local government institutions, Dmitro? Has decentralization missed something there? I'm asking you this specifically because you've been you've worked in a regional administration yourself. So has decentralization been harmful in this respect, that it did not pay enough attention to what we call systema?
Look, we should understand one thing. Ukraine is very much, and especially the elder population, is very much driven by inertia, and it means that people are used to, and they have a specific mindset. They expect the state of telling them what to do, how to do it, how to behave, and they consider the local administration chairman and the local council, the heads of the local councils, as basically somebody that should tell them what to do. I mean, it's not about who are we going to elect, right, on the local level, and why are we electing him? Because we expect something from him, because we expect some specific decisions, specific changes, and specific rules that have to be changed. It's about who we are gonna consider responsible for everything bad that is happening in our community. This is a very interesting way of putting it and of thinking. And I really witnessed this kind of mindset back in the Odessa region. The thing is that while you're representing a local authority, your only and the most important function is to be held responsible for everything. Instead of we tried to create this kind of democratic forum, a discussion platform with the local population to try to debate what should be the top priorities on local level and stuff like that. Out of 16,000, out of 60,000 of the population, I think the most active were like 2 or 3 people. And so it gives you a very fruitful ground for people who have money and resources and who can control the local media and who can control the local activists to immediately start criticizing everything the local authority is doing and the central authority is doing.
Point taken. Thank you, Dmitro. Maria
Right.
has another question for specifically you, which is why I am so impolite to interrupt you. Excuse me.
No
But
worries.
so
No
we
worries.
make the use of your time, good use of your time. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dmitro, for these very candid, great remarks. My question starts from a really good study done by Stan Marcus and Volha Sharnish on the sources of enrichment of Ukrainian oligarchs specifically. And what they find is that monopoly, movable assets, nothing predicts success as well as oligarchs' connections to political parties and ownership of media. So I'm wondering if you can speak specifically to how this law is going to tackle these 2 elements, connections to parties and ownership of media. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that the main point is to create a social pressure. And you see the problem with Ukraine, is also the fact that here the institution of image or reputation, it simply does not exist, it doesn't work. So for this reason, people don't really care if they are affiliated with some kind of oligarch or whoever. And in terms of some anti-corruption reports or or investigations, do you recall at least one resignation because of someone has been affiliated with an oligarch? That's the point. And what this law creates is basically it creates a system, an architecture of legal responsibility for being attached or being somehow aligned with a specific oligarch. So it basically forbids people who are considered and are nominated, I don't know how to call it properly, as oligarchs and the affiliated people to contact the stakeholders of the political system who might influence the state decision and therefore might influence the operation of the state-owned enterprises and etc. Are we sure that this will work? Of course not, but at least it will create, some tension and some pressure, which does not exist today. And therefore, if there is no sanction, you can do whatever you want. And for this reason, I think that this is a good point, because one thing is to disregard it, and to disregard the thing that well, I'm affiliated to someone, so what? What can you do to me? And another thing is to create a legal net that specifically provides some sanctions in case you are somehow affiliated, have been aligned or with someone that has been considered as an oligarch. I think this is the main point of it. I don't know. I don't know if you satisfied with my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitro. And then I pass the floor to Ola Piszczanska, please. Ola, what I find very interesting with your background is that you've seen the Ukrainian business sector or the financial industrial groups from the inside and from different perspectives. You've worked for Kryvyi when it was still a state-owned enterprise. This is a business we've come to know in the West after the first privatization was challenged as illegal because of alleged corruption. Then the second privatization took place. The bidding was on TV, and you then worked in the newly merged company ArcelorMittal Kryvyi Rih for a long time. So before you start with your intervention, I'd be also very interested to know what motivated you to change and go and work for the Anti-Monopoly Committee state structure.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join in the conversation and the discussion. It's a very interesting issue which we're considering today. Thank you for your interest in my background. It so happened in my life that I've managed to work within the sphere and paradigm of the Soviet Union as within such a huge structure as one of Ukraine's major plants, which is Kryvyi Rih Stal plant. And I also, so therefore, I know the Soviet rules from inside. I also worked within the system in the post-Soviet times and witnessed how the system transformed from the state-run to private, how the financial industrial groups were being transformed, and how business in Ukraine was being formed in the post-Soviet space. And again, I can say that I was lucky to be within this and to witness how all this was transforming and turning into an open world renowned practices of privatization, how that impacted our life, our outlook of the world, and our view of how economy should be run. And probably all that shaped my world outlook and my position and led me to the decision to start working for the Anti-Monopoly Committee. But before that, I also had a business of my own. It was a growing business, and one of the decisions to start working for the Anti-Monopoly Committee was my understanding that Ukraine has lots of opportunities, but even more hurdles and impediments, which very often push people to decisions which are kind of risky and not very modern, but people are kind of bound to do this. So it is my wish to promote competition for business and even playing field rather than the opportunity to know some people in power. That's what basically resulted in my decision to take this position in the AMCU, because this is the body which can have a positive influence on this and make a difference. If that answers your question, I could start my intervention, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Я дуже дякую всім учасникам сьогоднішньої
I would
дискусії.
like to thank all the participants in today's discussion. It was very interesting to listen to the presentation of the research paper about the crony capitalism systema in Ukraine. Thank you, John. It was very interesting for me to hear this view from outside, this kind of cold, impartial assessment, just like due diligent view from outside of the process, from someone who is not within the system he or she analyzes. So it is very relevant to hear this for someone from outside. And not just today, but over the years of Ukraine's independence, we have had a problem of excessive influence of FIGs. And to tackle this problem, we need to use a host of instruments. And I do agree with what Mr. Nataluka said, that we need to use political instruments, instruments for the development of such an instrument as reputation, because this is basically a non-existent instrument and notion in our country now. And we have to use the legal instruments which should make it possible to bring people who abuse the system to account. But as we find a solution to these issues, I suggest that we should take a look not just at the current situation in Ukraine, because now we are in the system of an active standoff, active confrontation, as it were. But rather, we should take into account the historic background or the formation of FIGs and vested interests in Ukraine. You can refer to them by different names, but basically we're talking about one and the same thing, about some groupings which formed at a certain point in time and abuse the system to their benefit now. It was quite aptly said in the presentation, the transition to market economy in Ukraine was propitious for the formation of FAGs and their concentration in strategically crucial sectors of our economy. Why did that happen? As Mr. Natalucha said today, as we transformed from the planned economy to the market economy, we failed to change the mentality of our approach to business. In the planned economy, individuals who held high political or industrial positions used their clout for their own benefit and used that power to switch to legitimate businesses. But their approach to business remained unchanged, just like was the case with the so-called red directors, as directors of major enterprises in the Soviet Union were referred to. So they pretty much remained around, and they used the system for their own enrichment and for rent-seeking, enriching themselves on major assets of the economy. Again, another thing that matters is that back in those years, the development of the economy was marked by the development of criminal groupings, which made it impossible to develop healthy, robust competition. All that led to the formation of shadow economy, which is pretty much around today and continues to ruin Ukraine's economy. Well, later down the road, Ukraine managed to more or less eradicate organized crime, but large business structures came in their place. And what is characteristic of young businesses is that they try to take key positions in different, various, non-related markets, but they wanted to have the monopoly position in each of these markets. Currently, we are seeing some changes in that respect because the FIGs focus on only strategically important sectors and the markets which have considerable social impact, like the mass media. That is why today, in my opinion, we have to focus on tackling this issue, because the mass media has a huge influence on the societal assessment of the performance of the powers that be and all those who are decision makers in one respect or another. In my opinion, another thing that matters in terms of the risks of excessive control in the crony capitalism is the fact that these groups are not interested in their development because they have no competition to compete against. That is why we have a lot of undertakings and a lot of markets which are largely underdeveloped in Ukraine, and they are concentrated within individual FIGs. And since a considerable part of those markets are economically, socially, and logistically crucial, all this situation leads us to the risks of dragging the whole society into this warfare. And as we plan our actions, we have to take into account all the above. And in my personal opinion, apart from the control and legal assessment and legal judgments on the FIGs and the vested interests, apart from all that, we also have to considerably focus on the issue of the development of large markets, because the world is rapidly developing new markets like media, digital, cyber, and we cannot focus exclusively on the markets which are at the top at the moment. We have to make sure how to provide Ukraine with the breakthrough markets which will make us modern and advanced. And by doing so, we will also manage to decrease the influence of FIGs and vested interests. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olga. John, do you have an immediate reaction to Olga's intervention? If that is not the...
No, I would simply question perhaps the last thought, which is a valid one, about the creation of these new markets and the idea that the existing financial industrial groups will somehow be displaced. The danger, of course, is that they enter those markets or interests connected with them and enter those markets, and I don't discount that at all. But I do understand the argument. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Ola, I have one question from the audience referring to discretion as the main source of patronalism in a recent book by Magyar and Maldovic. And the question is, or the statement and the question, both the anti-oligarch law and the anti-monopoly policies are very much discretionary. How to overcome this contradiction?
Well, thank you for your question. Well, as regards the first comment about the entry into the new markets of FIGs, it's obvious that they will be willing to take a share of new markets. But it is the establishment of new rules and oversight over the creation and development of these markets are the instruments which will prevent the receipt and abuse of any dominant positions by already existing FIGs or the would-be FIGs who would want to take a share in those markets. So when this is turned into a robust market, this should be about competition, and competition will take its course. As regards the second question, is your question about the discretionary authorities, and I guess the discretionary authorities of the committee, apart from other things, and how to address that. The Anti-Monopoly Committee has a clear-cut guidelines concerning discretionary powers, especially as regards fines. But discretionary powers should be in place, and in my opinion, this is okay, because violations differ and different undertakings have various reactions to certain reactions and actions taken against them. And sometimes a lot is being done to avoid punishment for irregularities. There are undertakings which are warned, for instance, for the first time, and there are repeated offenders. And in those issues, discretionary powers and the power discretion is instrumental, in my opinion. But there are clear guidelines that we are guided by as regards discretion. Thank you.
Thank you, Olha. You mentioned the importance of legal instruments. And of course, when businesses go to court or might go to court after being fined by the Anti-Monopoly Committee, it is crucial that the courts work competently, and also that businesses understand why they are being fined. So I would like to move on to Maria Popova, whose focus of research is the judiciary. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I usually present work on Ukraine, where I've been researching judicial reform for the last almost 20 years. But today, I'm going to bring in a comparative perspective from my ongoing other research on anti-corruption campaigns and the politics of corruption prosecutions in countries that are actually in many ways quite similar to Ukraine, Bulgaria and Romania. So let me share my screen. Okay, so let me start with the two countries and the contrast here. Bulgaria and Romania are as similar as countries come. They had a delayed post-communist transition in the 90s that developed in quite similar ways. Only by the end of the 90s did reformists come to power in both countries. They have moderately high corruption levels. They're right now in the EU, perhaps some of the most corrupt countries in the EU, quite similar there. As a result and as a response to this corruption, when they both joined the EU with a slight delay in 2007, rather than with the first wave in 2004, both countries were put under the cooperation and verification mechanism, which was the EU specifically trying to help these countries set up the right anti-corruption institutions, reform their judiciaries in order to tackle specifically their rule of law and corruption problems. So both countries were under tremendous, and have been throughout the last almost 15 years that they've been members of the EU, have been throughout constant pressure to root out corruption and make the judiciary more efficient. So as a result, there is in both countries quite a high indictment rate of politicians. In other words, a lot of politicians are going to court and or being taken to court to answer charges on corruption-related indictments. And for indictments, the research that I did focused specifically on cabinet ministers in order to sort of have a manageable group that we're looking at. Obviously, these are high-level political actors. And in Bulgaria, 21% of cabinet ministers have faced an indictment on corruption-related charges, 12% in Romania. And in fact, large numbers of ministers, again, 12% in Bulgaria and 7% in Romania, have actually had court judgments issued against them in a corruption prosecution. But here is where the similarities end. In Romania, we see major political figures. This is the leader of one of the major parties, the Socialist Party, another minister leaving court, heads down or in handcuffs. In fact, the conviction rate in all of these corruption prosecutions in Romania is 81, or has been 81.5%. In Bulgaria, we have all of these people leaving the courtroom with a broad smile on their face, because the conviction rate in Bulgaria is 0%. For all of these people indicted, no one has received an actual conviction. There have been some first instance convictions that have been that have been reversed on appeal. In many cases, in fact, the defendants in those cases have taken the first instance convictions to international courts and have won. So what my research suggests is that Romania has had an earnest anti-corruption campaign and a fairly successful de-oligarchization process. Some of the people convicted in Romania have been major, well-known oligarchs, and they've served effective prison sentences. Bulgaria, on the other hand, has led a facade anti-corruption campaign, and no de-oligarchization has really taken place. So the Western pressure and also societal pressure to do something about high corruption, crony capitalism, has produced some results in Romania, but in Bulgaria has produced a lot of activity and really not many results, a facade campaign. So what are the lessons for Ukraine about this from this comparative perspective? Well, it seems that Ukraine right now is at the crossroads. It's this crucial moment in which we're soon going to start getting some evidence about whether Ukraine is going down the Romanian path or the Bulgarian path. Is something going to be done about tackling oligarch domination of politics and prosecuting corruption. So what are some of the lessons from the Bulgarian and the Romanian experience? The first one, and here I want to very strongly agree with John's report, there is really no formal institutional silver bullet. There is no institution that can predictably produce a effective and good anti-corruption, earnest anti-corruption campaign. The differences between Bulgaria and Romania cannot be explained through institutional differences. Both countries have specialized anti-corruption prosecutions, Bulgaria has a specialized anti-corruption high court. There has been a flurry of activity. We cannot explain this difference through institutional engineering, so to speak. Reformists are more important. Putting reformists at the helm of institutions is really crucial, and Western allies need to support these reformists when the going gets tough, when there is political backlash from vested interests that seeks to unseat reformists at the crucial institutions who are pursuing anti-corruption in earnest. The West needs to support them and try to push the Ukrainian government not to fire them. So the contrast here is Laura Kövesi in Romania received a lot of support. Politicians tried to fire her several times. Eventually it worked, but in some crucial moments, Western support saved her. And the contrast here with Rябушапka, who did not receive this strong support, may be an opportunity missed. The second, or rather the third lesson, is that reformists in the prosecution are more effective than reformists in the Ministry of Justice or in the high courts. A reformed prosecution can clean up the judiciary too. So the example, this is a very important lesson from Bulgaria and Romania, because Bulgaria has had reformists at the helm of the Ministry of Justice and at the high courts, but because the prosecution is really a bastion of anti-reform, nothing has moved forward. The courts cannot solve the question if the cases that get to them are shoddy and purposefully shoddy because the prosecution doesn't want to do a good job. And fourth, there's the crucial question of whether the cleanup should start from the big fish or from the small fish. I mean, we all know that the fish rots from the head, but which fish should you go for first? And the comparative evidence here suggests that starting small is a better way to go. Obviously, it has legitimacy drawbacks because what the public wants to see is big fish being prosecuted and going to prison. But here is why I would suggest that starting small is better. Corruption cases are by definition very hard to prove, and prosecuting small fish is actually easier because their corruption schemes are less complicated. Easier cases allow prosecutors to build experience, to build confidence when they start winning them, and to build an esprit de corps in the institution, commitment to fighting corruption. When you see some results, it helps. Starting with the small fish also doesn't provoke as much political backlash and preemption from vested political interests. They can let some of the smaller fish go. But once success starts rolling in, the legitimacy gains start accruing, and the prosecution is then in a much better position to go after the big fish. So I think that's a lesson that may be quite relevant to Ukraine these days. And I will end here and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Starting small is also something John has recommended, albeit with relation to the courts. And Wilfried, to bring you in, I am wondering, we've heard now from Maria this comparison to Romania. However, she has not mentioned Nabu. We've heard earlier about the national security and defense country coming in as another institution. What is your opinion on the institutional setup in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much, Miriam. Thank you all for your very stimulating inputs. I would like really to begin with that and to start with that. That is institutional setting. And I would like to go back to John's very nice 4 pillars, why that limited access system is working. And I would add a political factor, which we cannot let out. And that is actually the president by itself. I mean, the umbrella patrimonial system is actually strengthened by all presidents of Ukraine. And actually what we see now by Zelensky, bringing institutes of the central executive power or certain competencies of them into the subordination of the president is not only anti-constitutional, it opens gateways for oligarchs to step in and to control financial flows. So I think what we should do at first is not to make symbolic lists of oligarchs, which will be highly problematic in the political competition in Ukraine. I already promise it now. And I promise you in a year, nothing will have changed with these oligarchs lists. What you have to do is very simple. You have to pay attention and you have to give respect to procedures and institutions actually when it comes to standardized selection processes of the heads of those bodies of governance who are crucial for the assets of the state. Customs Service, National Health Agency. What happened here in the last 2 years actually with the dismissal of Mr. Goncharov? We had a return to the past, and we had the same tendencies of Kuchma. We have a return to what I call a manual governance, a manual operational governance. If something is not working, and I think Zelensky does not do that because he wants to have any money or something. He has good intentions, yes, but there is a tradition of political post-Soviet culture to react to all these challenges with more centralism, with more grip of the president to institutions, which actually undermine the resistance and the resilience of these institutions. And that is one of the greatest problems we cannot rule out. Second part, if we speak all the time about we have to control those, we have to control these, we have to control that, please do not forget what we have to develop. How we Ukraine see in future, what is the alternative Ukraine, and what have we to do to create citizens which are empowered really to put in question the systema. And here I come to decentralization reform, and I must say we have here, excuse me, contradictory tendencies for the last months, actually since the local elections. What happened now in Slavyansk, only because there is some stagnation in the local council, Mr. Zelensky introduced civil military administrations. And what does it mean to have a civil administration in Ukraine? You have no influence of civil society. You have less influence of those who should be created by the strengthening of self-governance in substance. That was an original and absolutely correct approach. But what is happening now, that people who is heading now the civil administration and military administration, it's Mr. Yach, who is from the opposition bloc and is also part of Systema. But now Mr. Lach has two problems less. He has not only the political competition with the opposition platform, he also need not to treat every day with that very unpleasant civil society which is pressuring on him. And that is actually what we need. We need also a picture for the future, how Ukraine should look like as an alternative. And the last thing is, what I want to also comment on the papers is that I'm very thankful that you actually underline the prosecution. And I think that is very important to reflect what prosecution we need. And we need a prosecution which is not a part of executive power, as it is now the case. We need a prosecution which is decentralized. And here I also come to the let me say, deficits of the European Union, because the problems begin with Mr. Raboshapka. They did not begin after Mr. Raboshapka. Mr. Raboshapka, in the enthusiasm, firing bad people, got from Zelensky discretionary powers, which are still working, in order fully to make, to set out of work the whole setting, also the well-developed things in the disciplinary realm, in the qualification realm. And what is the result? Mr. Raboshapka, who had some good intention, has gone. But Mrs. Venediktova now, who calls herself a loyal to the president, now got overwhelming powers which even Mr. Lutsenko haven't had under Poroshenko. And that is simply the problem, that we too late, that European partners too late hear the warnings of Ukraine civil society, and civil society itself has made, let me say, the mistake to go from the one extreme only to reform institutions to the other extreme only to fire and recruit new people. Because if you fire people and have no standards where the new people can work in, nothing is won. And the last thing is, I would like to adopt also what John said in his recommendations. He said, we have to pay attention more to the lower level. I think, John, you spoke about the judges, yes, but I think the same is true for prosecution. So what we need is not trainings of French or German advisors, what is a good prosecutor? What we need is a work with them, how we can empower these people with guidelines that they can, in ambivalent and critical situations, preserve their autonomy as a preservers of the rule of law. That should be the aim, and that is not be done. That requires more efforts of the European side, but I think you cannot ask Ukraine to transform all institutions without making by yourself a transformation of institutional resources. That is, by the way, that is the core problem of the whole Eastern Partnership. We required so much from them, but we stand as a bystander, we look how they do it, and we should go more into the process, and we see with a high anti-corruption court, so we should not be frustrated. When we do that things very coherently, also being in the details, not only say broadly you have to reform something, but really in the details to work with them together with the civil society and the reformist inclined people in the government. They are also there, and we have now people here, Ms. Bishanska and Dimitru. We have good supporters, but we should be more committed to understand, and that is also for me the outcome of John's paper, that if we do not do that, then all these bad things under which Ukraine is suffering will come also to Europe, because we are also not clean. Our financial markets also not clean. And we see that all these methods of systema, they became already a principle, a general method of autocracies, not only beyond EU, but already within the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilfried. One follow-up question to you and Maria before I address Olha Pishanska once again. One person from the audience, Mattia Nellis from Kiev, asks about the specialized anti-corruption prosecutor who is newly or who is currently being selected anew. What are your expectations there? And I'd like to hear from both of you, how could the West have supported Ryaboshabka more, in your view, very concretely? And while you reflect on the question, Olha, we've heard from Wilfried that he fears more gateways for corruption. What do you respond? Because this also is a question to the work of your committee. Olha first, please.
Ну, по-перше, ми займаємося контролем і розвитком конкуренції.
Well, first of all, we deal, first of all, with the control of competition within Ukraine. So, as a head of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, I am in charge of what's going on in Ukraine in this respect. But currently, we are cooperating with relevant institutions in other countries as well, and we have some instruments to enhance our cooperation, probably for some joint investigations or for some other activities, because as we know, in the modern day and age, there are no borders in business. Therefore, obviously, the risk of inroads into other markets and countries is also evident. From myself, I can also add that corruption is a very contagious disease, and if it is not nipped in the bud, if it is not stopped in its tracks, it becomes a very attractive, attractive temptation. And this is a very interesting effect. And if you lose this fight, then the reputation suffers a lot. And the instrument of reputation and the institute of reputation is very relevant in the West, which should be the case in Ukraine as well. But this is something which is really important. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Olha. And now first Maria and then Wilfried, please. And I was thinking, John, since it's already 16:19, to give the final floor to you, the last 5 or 7 minutes, so you can comment on what you've heard from the other panelists who have been reacting to your 2 analyses. Maria, then Wilfried.
Thanks for the question about NABU and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutions Office. I mean, that is one of the wrinkles in the institutional setup, which is a bit problematic to me, because the division of investigation versus prosecution between 2 institutions that ended up competing, at some point, one had sort of more universally recognized reform credentials than the other. This creates a problem in staying focused on what is a very tough process of uncovering corruption. So to me, the new head of this office is crucial, and it is very important that they have strong reformist credentials, because the institutional powers alone are not going to solve the problem. It has to have the right person in place. And specifically on Ryabushapka, I mean, I'm not going to actually have, I don't have a very strong opinion over on his personality specifically. But my point is that if someone, because I see Wilfried sort of has some reservations there, whereas in another event, I heard, you know, a lot of praise for his reformist credentials, et cetera, et cetera. So my broader point here is that if we have someone who is taking the right steps and going in the right direction, it is as important for the West, for the Western allies, not just to look at the institutional structure, but to actually seek to prevent the firing of someone with well-burnished reformist credentials. Because this is what could have derailed the Romanian anti-corruption campaign several times. As Kövesi was becoming more and more powerful and asserting her office, there were several attempts to fire her that were prevented mainly by behind-the-scenes lobbying from European ambassadors to the Romanian government to say, don't go there. You have the right to fire her, but don't. So I think, you know, that's going back to the question of discretionary power, and it has its trade-offs. It's sometimes problematic because you may bet on the wrong person, but I think it's also, there has to be, unfortunately, it's a difficult process, but there has to be balance between pushing only institutional solutions and actually using discretion to support people who are earnestly pursuing the goals that we all believe in. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Yes, I fully agree with your last point, Maria. That was actually what I wanted to say. There is a disbalance between these two sides, and I have no reservations against Ryabushapka. I also, in the broader sense, wants to say the problem begins with the fact that the basic between president and prosecution, general prosecutioner, is a loyalty and nothing else. And if he does not bring the political results, Zelensky or the president, it is not about Zelensky, Poroshenko, it's not important. Then he is not to be tolerated again. That is a problem. And on the anti-corruption prosecution, I mean, I'm still hopeful, yes, but I would like to address one problem we have here, and that is also the problem we have with the High Qualification Commission of Judges. We have now a selection process for the commission of selection, which is very, very good, which is based on a very strong factor of international experts. That is very positive. But here also, in the end, these experts, so the mechanism is made in a way that the experts can prevent from the competition very dirty persons, yes? So they have the power to prevent people which have no ethical integrity. But what they cannot achieve is really to have a pool of the best. And the character of the pool of the best is decided by the quota of the parliament again. And so what we get, and we will also the case with the High Qualification Commission, where we have now again exit strategies for the unreformed High Council of Justice. We will get some average people, but it is very doubtful if we get the best people who are so autonomous in their position to preserve rule of law and equality of the citizens before the systema. That is the main point, and that is a detail we too early overlook, because what we have here, that contradiction between High Quality Commission and the still powers of the still unreformed High Council of Justice, is a red line since the first reform approaches in 2019. And we should be here also more consequent to the end when we also try to support the reformists in Ukraine and people like Maria has in mind. So maybe that on that. And because Maria already spoke on NABU, that is also or the problem, yes, of that system of power. Because 5 years ago, I was asked by NABU when it was implemented by Poroshenko, and I told them NABU has to be subordinated to the governor. And they told me, Wilfried, why is it important? I said, at first it's important because there is a constitution. And secondly, it's important because it will be used as an argument against the NABU when NABU will be very uncomfortable for the systema. That was actually the reason, and it was fully overlooked. And now it works against the NABU. And that is what I had in mind, why institutions matters. We should not fix on them, but we should also look at them that they legitimate and give us some measures to be not purely discretionary when we come to reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilfried. And before I give the floor to you, John, one question from the audience about the possibility to forbid business industrial groups from owning media assets by law. What is your opinion on that? Yeah, you have the floor, John.
Thank you, Miriam. I will try to be very, very brief since we don't have much time left. On the first issue, it is simply one of legality. At the end of the day, can you really say to major businesses that you are not allowed to own any media assets? They're off limits. How are you going to pass legislation to do this, and how are you going to enforce that legislation? But still very interesting, nevertheless, to see recently that President Zelensky was able to introduce sanctions against the owner of television channels believed to be ultimately owned by Mr. Medvedchuk. That was possible. My impressions, first of all, listening to Dmytro, very sobering, actually, to hear him talking about how Systema, despite the arrival of the Zelensky administration, this new and very large group of MPs, most of them novice MPs, that Systema has still made itself felt to such a degree that it is still there, it is still so present. I was also struck by what Olga said about the risk of dragging society into this confrontation. And in some ways, I'm still surprised that society isn't perhaps closer to the confrontation that she describes and more involved. And perhaps that has something to do with the inertia that Dmytro referred to. Maria, in the case of Romania as a country I've studied a little bit, there have always been questions about the degree to which the prosecutions were in fact politicized, and how a very powerful anti-corruption agency in fact took on some quasi-political role. So I think that perhaps has to be examined. But I was struck recently in the case of Bulgaria, which you described very well in my view, by the fact that the US Treasury ultimately sanctioned 3 influential individuals, one certainly classified as an oligarch, Mr. Pievsky. And my Bulgarian friends tell me that this is going to have a transformative effect on Bulgarian politics. So very interesting to see that the US has used its power here, when I think the EU has been, in fact, remarkably weak in dealing with Bulgaria. To Wilfried's points, I absolutely agree with the dangers of this manual control. And the fact that Zelensky, for all his, I think, largely noble motivations, is in fact using a methodology that was practiced so widely and with such, I believe, destructive effect in the 1990s or beginning then. But the question I think that we're still struggling to ask here among ourselves is, what does it actually take to achieve a real breakthrough in terms of fracturing the grip of Systema? And I think we still have a lot to do to try to find an answer to that question.
Thank you, John, for these final remarks. I think it is clear that it is of vital interest to us all. You've mentioned the EU, that we have well-governed neighboring countries. And good governance and the rule of law is also what allows people to look into the future with confidence. I'd also bring in the topic of trust, which I believe is important for society to not be polarized. And you're absolutely right, or Dimitro has been pointing to the inertia, but let's also not forget that particularly Ukrainian society is so tremendously engaged, and that we are where we are. We spoke about the crossroads and whether it's possible now to cut the Gordon knot because of Ukrainian society staying there and closely monitoring and asking for changes. Thank you for staying with us for these 1.5 hours. I again feel that we've barely scratched the surface, but on the other hand, that gives us new ideas for further work. Thank you, Orissia, for an excellent cooperation, also to Anna. Thank you very much to the interpreters. And the organizers have asked me to ask you to fill in a quick satisfaction survey that will appear on your screen now, I suppose, Anna, or how is it to be accessed?
After we finish, everyone will receive it.
Okay. So I remain just giving you my best wishes for the upcoming soccer match. Since I'm German, I can wholeheartedly support Ukraine, and have a nice evening.